الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I hope everyone's well. So last week, or the last few weeks, we've been talking about the journey of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and we touched on the story of Sayyidina Ismail. And over the course of the week, I've had a few questions come through. So just over text message or people that have listened in that know me that have just over a phone conversation just brought it up. So I thought I'd probably start with those, because what it does is it fills some of the gaps that I missed out. And yeah, so I deemed that it's important enough for actually to cover them. So we'll start there. I'll take some of those questions which I've got, and then we'll get into the story, inshallah. So in terms of the just overall where we got to was, we said that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, he had moved from his hometown. He was, not exiled, but he was actually commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to move to another land, which is in modern day, it's on the kind of outskirts of Sham, place called Haran or Hiran. And then from there he went to he went to the land of Canaan or Canaan, and he was then commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to and on the way to Canaan, he heard of a famine, and he then left to a place we believe was in Egypt, where they met this tyrannical ruler, and from there Hajar was gifted to Sayyida Sara. And then we know many years passed, and I mentioned last week and the week before, in fact, that actually there's a lot of gaps that are not filled, and what appeared to be just a few months actually turn out to be dozens of years, because Sayyidina Ibrahim goes from being a child to being 86 years old, and we don't really know the particulars of what happened. Eventually, when Sayyidina Ismail is born through Hajar, he is commanded by God to take them to this barren place, which we now know to be Mecca, but at the time it was a completely deserted land. And then we talked a bit about how the Zamzam came to be. So there were a few gaps that I didn't really fill, which I want to start with today. And then from there, eventually, I mentioned that Sayyidina Ibrahim visited Ismail. We know explicitly on at least 3 occasions, but the suggestion that actually he went frequently, he would go to meet his son, and then he would go back home and meet his and live with his wife Sara, and then she was to give them another child, Ishaq. And then in one of those visits, when he returned back, he was commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to build this building called the Kaaba. And eventually we know that both Sayyidina Ismail and Hajar died and were buried near the Kaaba. In terms of the first question that I had was just about the historicity of this journey to Egypt. Like where is that founded? And I said that we don't know whether the gift was from the king of Egypt or it may have been from the king of Jordan. And the reason why that difference exists is because the actual basis for the story it's found in hadith. It's a sound hadith narrated by Imam al-Bukhari. It's part of quite a long hadith. And in it, one of the narrations is, and I think I quoted a part of it in probably my first or my second session, it's narrated by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And in it, he said that Sayyidina Ibrahim had to tell a quote unquote lie or untruth on 3 occasions. He was forced to do that. And one of those occasions, he says, قال لم يكذب إبراهيم عليه السلام إلا 3 كذبات He said, except on 3 occasions. He says one of those was, and to mention the Quran, when he said inni saqim, when he was asked by when he decided that he was going to destroy the idols in his hometown, and the people are going to a party, and they asked him why he wasn't coming, and he said, I'm ill. He said inni saqim. So that was the first. Second one was bal fa'alahu kabiruhum hadha, was when they returned back. Again, we talked about Surah Safat, and I'm not going to cover that again, but how this story kind of moves from surah to surah. And this is when the people came back and they found that actually the idols had been destroyed, and the only one still standing was the largest of them. And when they asked Sayyidina Ibrahim whether he had done it, he said no, it was rather the largest of them. And the third occasion he mentions is the story of Sayyidah Sara, and he goes into the details. He says, وَقَالَ بَيْنَا هُوَ ذَاتَ يَوْمٍ وَسَارَ إِذْ أَتَى عَلَى جَبَّارٍ مِنَ الْجَبَابِرَةِ. He said that it happened to be one day that Sarah came upon one of the tyrants, on the land of a tyrant. It doesn't tell us what that land is. It doesn't tell us where that land is, which is where the difference of opinion comes from. فقيل له إنها هنا رجلا معه امرأة من أحسن الناس فأرسل إليه فسأله عنها فقال من هذه قال أختي. That when this tyrant said, there's a woman that's amongst the most beautiful women I've ever seen, and there's a man with her. Who is this man? And when they asked Sayyidina Ibrahim, he said, this is, she is my sister. And then Sayyidina Ibrahim said to Sarah, when they ask you, say exactly what I said. Lam yukadhibni, la yukadhibni. Don't falsify what I've already said. And I mentioned when I spoke about this narration in a previous lesson, that he did that to save his own life, and that's perfectly within. That's not only is it a recommended thing to do to save your own life, it's a wajib thing to do. If one is forced to lie to save life or limb, then absolutely it's perfectly acceptable to save life and limb, and more so if it means tying kinship bonds, that means with family, so that it doesn't lead to people kind of family feuds, or within your immediate family in terms of your spouse, that to tell a white lie that has no harm, but it's done with the best of intention, with a sincere for a sincere reason, which is to not cause friction, then that is perfectly acceptable to do. Okay, so we don't just believe that not every lie is sinful, but by lie what we mean is something that ultimately stems from this desire to harm. So this is the third occasion that he mentions, and the hadith goes on to describe what happened in that situation. He said, وَإِنْ هَذَا سَأَلْنِي فَأَخْبَرَتْهُ أَنَّكِ أُخْتِ فَلَا تُكَذِّبِينِ فَأَرْسَلَ إِلَيْهَا فَلَمَّا دَخَلَتْ عَلَيْهِ ذَهَبَتْ يَتَنَاوَلُهَا بِيَدِهِ. And when Sarah went into the chamber of this tyrant, he tried to attack her, and immediately it says, فَقَالَ إِدَّعِ اللَّهِ وَلَا أَضُرُّكِ. And then when he tried to hide, he said, for ukhiza, he had been, something stopped him, like he froze. And then he said, call upon God to help me. And then the hadith continues in that fashion, and describes at the end of it that he then was afraid, and he said, this woman is not a human being, she's something else. And he then gifted, out of fear, he gifted them Hajar, and then Sarah had Hajar. So that's the answer to the first question. Where's the source for this? And the source for it, as I said, is Sahih Bukhari, but it doesn't detail where this happened. That's filled by historians. The other question that I had was about Sayyidina Ismail and when Sayyidina Ibrahim left them in the valley of outside Mecca, or in Mecca. What's the source for that? Now, the source for that is actually in Surah Ibrahim, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ جَعَلْ هَذَا الْبَلَدَ آمِنًا. واجنبني وبني أن نعبد الأصنام رب إنهن أضللن كثيرا من الناس فمن تبعني فإنه مني ومن عصاني فإنك غفور رحيم. And then he says ربنا إني أسكنت من ذريتي بواد غير ذي زرع عند بيتك المحرم ربنا ليقيموا الصلاة فاجعل أفئدة من الناس تهوي إليهم وارزقهم من الثمرات لعلكم يشكرون. This whole section up to Yashkurun in verse 35 to 45, verse 35 to 37 in Surah Ibrahim is about that incident. So what we learn from that is, and there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari which gives us the full account of what happened, gives the full account. What's interesting about this this verse is we learn from it why Sayyidina Ibrahim left, the wisdom behind why God sent Sayyidina Ibrahim to leave his newborn child and his and Hajar there. It says liyuqimus salah, so that they may establish the prayer. This is a barren land where nobody would stay because there was no water, there was nothing there for people to stay in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided that there was going to be a community would flourish there, which would reach every part of the world. And that's how it was. So it was liyuqimus salah faj'al afidatan minan nas, and Sayyidina Ibrahim makes a dua to God when he turns away after having left Hajar and Sayyidina Ismail. When he walks away, and Sayyidina Hajar asks him, has God told you to do this? And he says yes. As he walks away, the narrations describe that when he walked behind the valley, that's when he raised his hands and he made this dua: oh Allah, I have left my child, my family, my min dhurriyati, from my offspring. I have left them to you, and I've taken them to this land that is barren. It says غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ. It has no vegetation. And it says in the بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ, to your sacred land. So there was something that he knew. Now, that would have been revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when that happened, he said, Rabbana lituqimus salah, and oh Allah, I did this so that they may establish the prayer. Now, if you go further down in Surah Ibrahim, just a few verses down, what we find is Alhamdulillahi alladhi wahaba li ala al-kibari Ismaila wa Ishaq, and all praises to Allah who gifted to me ala al-kibari, in my old age, Ismail and Ishaq. Inna Rabbi la sami'ud du'a, that my Lord is certainly the one who hears dua. Rabbi ja'alni muqima salah wa min dhurriyyati rabbana wa taqabbal du'a. Rabbana ighfir li wa liwalidayya wa lil mu'minina yawma yaqumul hisab. So this is where we find this dua that all of us read in our prayer. It came from Sayyidina Ibrahim calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after Allah had given him in his very old age Ishaq and Ismail, and he said, oh Allah, Rabbi ja'alni, make me of those who establish the prayer. Through who? Through Sayyidina Ismail, for example, because he sent him to a land where he was to establish the prayer, and in that case that dua was the prayer, but not only the prayer but the entire ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we'll go on to this shortly, but this is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is known as the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and I'll come on to that verse inshallah shortly. The hadith is quite a long hadith. It's in Sahih Bukhari. It's in the book of prophets, and I'll go through it very briefly just because I've been asked just to touch on this, and it'd be a shame if we don't at least go through some of these narrations inshallah. But I definitely recommend that you read the whole hadith. It has the whole qissa, the whole story in it from beginning to end in one place, so it's worth finding it online inshallah. So it's narrated by Sayyidina Ibn Abbas radiyallahu an, and it begins by describing Sayyidah Sara, and it goes on to, it says حتى وضعهما عند البيت عند دوحة فوق زمزم في أعلى المسجد. Then it goes on to how Sayyidina Ibrahim, I'm going to miss the first bit out, it goes into how Sayyidina Ibrahim left Sayyidina Ismail and his mother by the in the haram, just by the place of the Zamzam fi a'lam, at the top part of the masjid. وَلَيْسَ بِمَكَّةَ يَوْمَئِذٍ أَحَدٌ. So what it tells us that nobody was there at that time. The masjid, the haram at that time was not somewhere where people are going and praying. It wasn't a place of pilgrimage. So it says يَوْمَئِذٍ أَحَدٌ. Nobody was there at that time. وَلَيْسَ بِهَا مَاء. And there was no water there whatsoever, which is where the Jurhum comes in, and we'll talk about that, because that was another question I had. فوضعهما هناك ووضع عندهما جرابا فيه تمر وسقاء فيه ماء. And Sayyidina Ibrahim did, so the hadith tells us he did leave some food for them. He left some dates and some water for them to be able to look after themselves for a short while. And then Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam left. فقالت يا إبراهيم أين تذهب. And this is where Sayyidina Ibrahim is asked by Hajar, where are you going? وتتركنا بهذا الوادي الذي ليس فيه إنس ولا شيء. Are you going to leave us in this valley where there is nobody at all, no person and no thing? فقالت له ذلك مرارا. And she kept repeating this. In other words, he didn't respond. وجعل لا يلتفت إليها. And he and each point he did not respond to her. فقالت له الله الذي أمرك بهذا. Was it Allah who commanded you to do this? قال نعم. And that's when he turned and he said yes. قالت إذن. She said therefore لا يضيعنا. And then that he will never leave us. He will never leave us to waste. ثم رجعت فانطلق إبراهيم حتى إذا كان عند ثنية حيث لا يرونه استقبل بوجهه البيت. And then when he went behind the valley where he was no longer visible to them, at that point it says istaqbala, he faced the qibla. ثم دعا بهؤلاء الكلمات. And that's when he raised his hands and he made this dua, ربنا إني أسكنت من ذريتي بواد غير ذي زرع, the verse that I read up to يشكرون. And that's, so that hadith tells us that, but then the hadith has a lot more detail in the sense that it actually goes on and tells us what happened in at that time. So it says that as Ismail got thirsty, she began running up between Safa and Marwa. فقامت عليه ثم استقبلت الوادي تنظر هل ترى أحدا فلم ترى أحد. And that each time she would run up to the top of the hill and she would look around, has anyone seen me? Can I see anyone? And when she couldn't, she would run the other way, just like a distressed mother would, where her child is crying and she wants to feed him. فهبطت من الصفا حتى إذا بلغت الوادي رفعت طرف درعها ثم سعى الإنسان المجهود حتى جاوز الوادي ثم أتت المروة فقامت عليها. And then she did the same thing for Safa and Marwa. ففعلت ذلك 7 مرات, and she did this 7 times. And Ibn Abbas says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فذلك سعي الناس بينهما. And he said, this is why the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم taught us then. At that point, Ibn Abbas says, in telling the story, that the Prophet said, this is why we go between Safa and Marwa during our pilgrimage. فلما أشرفت على المروة سمعت صوتا. When she was on Marwa, that's when she heard the voice. And it says, and she thought, she was wondering where it came from. And she thought maybe it's just I'm hearing things. And then again the voice came. And it said, إن كان عندك غواث فإذا هي بالملك. She thought, is this somebody who has water? What is this? Who is this? Someone? And then she realized that it was an angel. عند موضع زمزم. And this angel stood over the place which was to become the well of Zamzam. حتى ظهر. And then it says in this narration, فبحث بعقبه, that he then dug into it with his heel, or it says أو قال بجناحه, or it may have been, I mean the narrator is unsure, or it may have been that he said he dug into it with his wing. حتى ظهر الماء, and water began to flow. فجعلت تحوضه وتقول بيدها هكذا, and then she started shouting zam zam, meaning stop stop, and that's where the name Zamzam comes from. وجعلت تغرف من الماء في سقائها وهو يفور بعدما تغرف. قال ابن عباس قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يرحم الله ابن إسماعيل لو تركت زمزم, أو قال لو لم تعرف من الماء لكانت زمزم عينا معينا. And the hadith also goes on. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he said, thank God for Hajar, the mother of Ismail, because had she not told the water to stop, the water have never stopped. It would never have stopped. Yeah. Because in the calling it Zamzam, it was her dua that made it flow, and it was her dua that would could only make it stop. So I was at that point that when the Zamzam started flowing, and then she settled, she started feeding her child Ismail, and that's when this tribe came. And that was another question I had, which is, how did the Jurhum end up there, and where did they come from? Now, firstly, Makkah itself was not a land where people lived, because it was completely barren. There was nothing there. There was no water. Now, this tribe were passing through, and they noticed birds gathering. When they saw that, they suspected there might be water there. And when they arrived, they saw that there was a mother looking after her child, and there was some water that was coming through. And they asked her about it. And then they decided to set up camp there. And that's where the story kind of takes off it's in a different direction now, because now it becomes, there's a big gap in terms of what we know about it. This hadith explains quite a bit, and I will touch on this. But we know that Sayyidina Ismail grows up amongst the people of Jurhum. Now, who are the Jurhum? The Jurhum, in previous lessons, I've talked about the different types of Arabs. The first type are the extinct Arabs, and amongst them, there was a group called the Jurhum. The Jurhum are called Al-Jurhum al-Ula, the first Jurhum. They were from the children of Ad. They all became extinct, right? But there was a group of Arabs that met with these extinct Arabs and lived with them for a bit, and they survived, right? And they're known as the pure Arabs now, because they survived and they interacted with the purest Arabs, meaning the original Arabs. So the extinct Arabs are the original Arabs. Then you have the pure Arabs that lived and were immersed within that culture. Now, these Arabs moved from various parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but predominantly settled in Yemen. But there were different tribes. And they're seen as they're seen as being part of, or the children of, somebody called Qahtan. Yeah, Qahtan. Qahtan is considered widely to be the father of those pure Arabs. The Qahtan are known to be the pure Arabs. They met and interacted, or at least originally in many years earlier, they would have interacted with the Arabs that then became extinct. Now, the children of Qahtan moved and lived in different parts. The Jurhum were amongst them. The Jurhum, they lived in and around the Hijaz. So they lived in and around the Hijaz. So they were already in the Arabian Peninsula. They were already in the surrounding areas where there was water. But they were a traveling nation, because people did, caravans would move from one place to another. They weren't necessarily settled. And we know, and later on, there was again from the children of Qahtan, the purest Arabs that we know, that the Arabs we call the pure Arabs today are the children of Saba. So all the pure Yemenis are considered to be the children of Saba, and Saba was one of the children of Qahtan. So what happened is, there used to be a dam in Yemen, called the Dam of Ma'rib, or Ma'rib, and this dam, when it burst, a lot of those Arabs, those pure Arabs from the children of Saba, they also moved to the Hijaz and moved to various parts, but they were ended up in Mecca. So what you had then is a mixture of the Jurhum Arabs, which were again, they descended from Qahtan, and then you had this from children of Saba, who were also considered the pure Arabs, and they predominantly stayed in Yemen, but then they moved, many of them moved to the Hijaz, and then you had this interaction that happened. So the Jurhum was that one type of pure Arab, which Sayyidina Ismail grew up amongst. And this hadith in Sahih Bukhari describes him as a young child playing with the Jurhums, the people of Jurhum, growing up amongst those children, learning their language, because prior to that, he would have spoken a different language, Hebrew, Aramaic, it wouldn't have been Arabic. So he would have learned pure Arabic tongue through this Jurhum tribe. And as time went on, they assimilated in that Ismail spoke their language fluently, and he was counted as amongst them. And the hadith also tells us that the same hadith in Sahih Bukhari goes on to, and describes it. In fact, I'll go through it. When the in terms of the Dam of Saba, that is actually mentioned in the Quran. It's one of the kind of the historical facts, the miracles of the Quran, that there's an entire surah called Surah Saba. And in Surah Saba, Allah mentions, for example, He said, لَقَدْ كَانَ لِسَبَا فِي مَسْكَنِهِمْ آيَةٌ, that regarding the people of Saba, that in their dwelling there is a great sign. جَنَّتَانِ عَنْ يَمِينٍ وَشِمَالٍ, there were gardens on both the right and the left. It's a beautiful dam which still existed. I mean, it was destroyed and then it was rebuilt, and then it was recently partially destroyed again. كلوا من رزق ربكم واشكروا له بلدة طيبة, and Allah says it was a beautiful city, ورب غفور, and it had a great forgiving Lord. So many of the scholars say that this is in reference to this dam bursting, because the next verse says فأعرضوا فأرسلنا عليهم سيل العرم, that when they turned away from God, when these people turned away from God, Allah sent to them the wave of Arim, and they say it was the wave of Arim that destroyed the dam. And then those people moved to many of the Jahili Arabs. Then, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they would have descended from these various tribes. Some of them would have been Adnani, some of them would have been pure from the Jurhum, and some of them would have been purely from the people of Sabah. So you had this mixture of people that lived and assimilated within each other. So what happens is then, in terms of Sayyidina Ismail, as he grows up, the hadith tells us that he married 2 women, and we suspect both of them were from the people of Jurhum. Yeah, there's difference of opinion as to whether both were from Jurhum or one of them was from Jurhum, but at least one of his wives was from the people from Jurhum. And that's where the line that comes from them are known as the Adnani Arabs, which is where the Prophet came from. So Sayyidina Ibrahim, we know, according to the hadith, he would come and visit Sayyidina Ismail. And one of those occasions that he visited him, he came to the house of Sayyidina Ismail, and he wasn't home, he was out. And Sayyidina Ibrahim met his wife, and he asked her, how is life here where you live? And she said, it's harsh, it's rough. We have no money, we have no livelihood. And she was very negative. And she had a bit of, the historians describe it as a temper. She was quite aggressive in how she says things. However, the hadith describes her as being more very dismissive and negative and not really very grateful. And in this hadith, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam says to her, he says, قال فإذا جاء زوجك, that when your husband returns home, فأقرئي عليه السلام, then give him my salam. وقولي له يغير عتبة بابك, he says to her, tell your husband when he comes home, meaning Sayyidina Ismail, when he comes home, that I gave him salam. He didn't tell her who he was. He just said, tell him I gave salam, and tell him that maybe she should change the lock on his house, on his door, the doorknob on his house. So she's confused. When Sayyidina Ismail comes home, she says, this man came, and he said, okay, who was he and what did he ask? He said, ja'ana shaykhun, he came, an old man came to the house, kaza wa kaza. فَسَأَلْنَا عَنْكَ, and he asked me regarding you. فَأَخْبَرْتُهُ, and I told him, our situation. I told him that you went home. وسألني كيف عشينا فأخبرته, and he asked us how we lived, what our life was like, and and I told him, that we're in في جهد وشدة, that we're in just hardship constantly. قال فهل أوصاكي, and he said, did he give you any advice, any نصيحة? قالت نعم, she said yes. He said أمرني أن أقرأ عليك السلام, that I should give you some salam, ويقول غير عتبة بابك, and he said change the handle on your door. And قال ذاك أبي, he said that's my father. That's my father. So he knew just by the way his father spoke. He said, that's my father. وَقَدْ أَمَرَنِي أَنْ أُفَارِقُكِ. He said, and he's told me to that I need to divorce you. Yeah, I need to separate from you. And وَتَزَوَّجَ مِنْهُمْ أُخْرَى. And then according to this narration, he then married another woman. فَلَبِثَ عَنْهُمْ Ibrahim. And then Sayyidina Ibrahim visited him again. So it shows that he did visit him. But the narrations describe this as very much a case of Sayyidina Ibrahim stayed away because it was a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Sayyidina Ismail had to assimilate and be brought up in this tribe, and his parentage was always going to be through Sayyidina Ibrahim, and the nasiha and everything that he got that made him who he was came through Sayyidina Ibrahim. But actually a lot of his upbringing had to be in completely immersed in that environment. That was the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Sayyidina Ibrahim, that he would have to come and do certain. That's why he only visited him when God commanded him to visit him, to do, these for these individual situations that this narration describes. And again, so Sayyidina Ibrahim visits again, and this time, ثم أتاهم بعد, he came afterwards. فلم يجده, and again Sayyidina Ibrahim didn't find his son, he wasn't there. فدخل على امرأته, and he came upon his wife, and he asked her about him. فقالت خرج ينبغي لنا, يبتغي لنا. She said he's left in search of something for us, meaning she was quite in the language she used, she wasn't as coarse as the other lady. قال كيف أنتم, and then Sayyidina Ibrahim said, how are you, how are you living, are you prospering? And she said, she was very upbeat about everything. فقالت نحن بخير وسعة, said we are, alhamdulillah, we are well, we are God's looked after us. وسعة meaning everything is wide, everything is okay, we're not restricted in any way. And she says, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فقال ما طعامكم, and she said, he said, what do you eat, what is your food? And she said, قالت اللحم, she said, we eat meat. قال فما شرابكم, said, what do you drink? She said, الماء, we drink water. And then Sayyidina Ibrahim made this dua. He said, قال اللهم بارك لهم في اللحم والماء. And Sayyidina Ibrahim made this dua that may Allah give you barakah in the meat that you eat, that you consume, and the water that you drink. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ولم يكن لهم يومئذ حب ولو كان لهم دعا لهم فيه. He said at that time they didn't have seeds, they weren't in a place of agriculture. And he said had they have been a place of agriculture and Sayyidina Ibrahim made that dua, they would have been completely inundated with crop. Yeah. So whatever Sayyidina Ibrahim asked for, he was given. He's known as, in this hadith for this too, he was mustajab, meaning somebody whose dua is accepted. And we know there are certain occasions that happen. So Safa and Marwa are those occasions where there's hadith for being mustajabud da'wat. When you get to the top of Safa or the top of Marwa and you make dua, it is mustajabud, it means it's accepted. It's definitely accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sayyidina Ibrahim's dua was like that. لهم دعا لهم فيه قال فهما لا يخلو عليها أحد بغير مكة إلا لم يوافقاه. And it's quite nice. This is shows again the how much the Prophet was in tune with the needs of the human body, in that he knew things that many people wouldn't have understood, but at the same time he had this complete reliance on God, in that he says Allah put barakah in meat and water for the people of Makkah. He said that means it's good for those people. He said for any other people, if they were to survive on meat and water alone, it would not be good for them. Having so much meat would not be good for them. So even in Sahih Bukhari, there's a hadith that tells us that the Prophet ﷺ recognized that having too much meat was not good for you. And actually, even though we know that the Prophet ﷺ did eat a type of meat, this meat that's being referred to is called tharid, which is a meat which is mixed sometimes with bits of bread or maize. and eaten. And there's another type of meat that they would eat, which is dry meat, which is something that you would have to survive off in a hot climate, which is meat that's dried out. Yeah, qadidul lahm. It's dried meat. It's very chewy, and they would eat it because it would be something that they would that could that could survive the desert heat. Otherwise, it would just go off. So they'd dry it out, which meant it could last for weeks, if not months, and perhaps even longer. And when it came to milk, they would have something like, although it's not narrated about the process, but we know that Bedouin Arabs, the way they would they preserve milk is by you can buy kefir now. Kefir, which is this bacteria, natural bacteria that exists, that you can put into milk. You can buy these grains. What that does is it kind of it multiplies in the milk, and it's actually very good for you. It's very good bacteria. But it would be used in the deserts for people that want to do it. They weren't necessarily trying to get the nutrients and try to get the good bacteria inside them. For them, it was about getting milk to last, because if you put milk out in the heat, it would go off. By putting this kefir into it, it means that milk can last for for a very long time. It just won't go off. The only problem is it ferments. So if you leave it for long enough, it will become quite strong. So you need to you can't leave it for too long. But they had their methods of food being preserved so they can eat it for a longer period of time. So laham that they ate was actually quite a natural meal that they'd have, and it was the most available meal in a land that wasn't otherwise, they didn't have agriculture available to them. But the hadith recognizes the value of eating ferments. Yeah, it's the value of eating vegetables, and the fact that having just meat and water is not a good diet for for the rest of us. And then and then on this occasion, the Sayyidina Ibrahim says, he says to her, he says, "Oh, where is when Sayyidina, when your husband comes back, give him my regards, and tell him that he should keep hold of this gate, keep hold of the threshold of the gate." And she's confused as to what that means. And when Sayyidina Ismail comes back, he says, "What happened? This man came. Who was he? He was an old man. What did he say?" He said, keep hold of that gate." And he said, that was nasiha from my father, that I should make sure I hold on to you. Now, what that teaches us is there's lots of lessons you can take from it, but one is in terms of the relationship of Sayyidina Ismail with his father, complete certitude. He knew that his father only acted upon revelation. So when he told him to get rid of that first wife was not good for him, it was because Sayyidina Ibrahim had been commanded by God to pave the way for what was to come. And what was to come was this this generation, eventually the generation that would come, that would within which the Prophet ﷺ was born. And that was not going to come through the first wife, it was going to come through this second wife. And that's what happened. The second wife is where he bore children, and Adnan came from there, and so on, which we'll come on to, inshallah. And then on another occasion, again, this hadith tells us this, that on another occasion, Sayyidina Ibrahim comes back, and this time he finds Sayyidina Ismail, and he says to him, "Allah has commanded me to build a structure." And Sayyidina Ismail again says, "We do exactly as our Lord commands," right? With absolutely no question whatsoever. He says, "We do exactly as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands." And he says, we're to build a structure with these qawa'id min al-bayt, these huge, this erected building. And the hadith describes how they did it. Sayyidina Ismail would, it says, "Ya'ti bil hijara." Sayyidina Ismail would do the heavy lifting. He would come and bring the blocks, and Sayyidina Ibrahim would place them. فَوَضَعَهُ لَهُ, and Sayyidina Ibrahim would place them. فَقَامَ عَلَيْهِ. So it says, قال فعند ذلك رفع القواعد من البيت فجعل إسماعيل يأتي بالحجارة وإبراهيم يبني حتى إذا ارتفع البناء جاء بهذا الحجر فوضعه له فقام عليه فهو يبني وإسماعيل يناوله الحجارة. That his father would place the blocks of the Kaaba, and Sayyidina Ismail would collect them. And eventually, when it got quite high, then Sayyidina Ismail would, his father sat at the top, and Sayyidina Ismail would climb up to make it as easy as he can for his father, so his father didn't have to stretch too much, because he was quite old at this point. Sayyidina Ismail would do a lot of the work, so his father just had to position it. So the barakah of his father is that the positioning, and he wanted to make sure that his father ultimately had the last hand in it, but he did, the heavy lifting with him. And then until they kept doing it until they eventually had this. وَهُوَ يَبْنِي وَإِسْمَعِيلُ يُنَاوِلُهُ الْحِجَارَةَ وَهُمَا يَقُولَانَ. And as they were doing this, they kept reciting رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. They kept reciting this verse, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. They would recite this, which is found in the Quran. So in terms of, there's the verse in Surah Baqarah, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ اجْعَلْ هَذَا بَلَدًا آمِنًا وَارْزُقْ أَهْلَهُ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ مَنْ آمَنَ مِنْهُمْ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ قَالَ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَأُمَتِّعُهُ قَلِيلًا ثُمَّ اضْطَرُّهُ إِلَى عَذَابِ النَّارِ وَبِئْسَ الْمَصِيرُ. So Sayyidina Ibrahim, before he begins building the Kaaba, he turns to God and he said, "Oh Allah, make this a baladan amina. Make this a sanctuary for your people. Make this a sanctuary." And we know now that's what we call it, al-balad al-haram, the sacred city, and the Masjid al-Haram, the sacred sanctuary. So to such an extent that you're not even allowed to hunt in that sanctuary. Everything completely was at peace there. If any battle is happening, whatever war is happening, it was a peace treaty when you entered the sacred city. Nobody fought, and that's historically always been the case. When they were fighting, when there were tribes fighting in the kind of in Muslim history, there was an agreement that the moment you step foot in the blessed city of Mecca, all of that has to be parked, and you pray and you live as brothers. And when you depart, then you can resume your fight. So this is the dua of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And the Surah Baqarah in verse 1 to 7 then goes on and describes the specifics of وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمَ الْقَوَاعِدِ. And when Sayyidina Ibrahim was commanded to raise the pillars, meaning of the Kaaba, وإسماعيل, and Sayyidina Ismail was with him, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا. Oh Allah, accept this from us. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. You are the one who is hearing and the one who knows. رَبَّنَا وَاجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. Oh Allah, make us of those who believe, of you, and amongst our progeny. أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. Make them a people that will submit to you. وَأَرِنَا مَنَاسِكَنَا وَتُبْ عَلَيْنَا. Oh Allah, and show us as in how would you translate manasik? The different pillars of what we're supposed to do. Yeah, وَتُبْ عَلَيْنَا, and forgive us. So so مَنَاسِكَنَا وَتُبْ عَلَيْنَا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ التَّوَّابُ الرَّحِيمُ. You are the one who is most, the one we turn to, the Tawwab, and you are the most merciful. رَبَّنَا وَابْعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا. So I mentioned earlier that the dua of Sayyidina Ibrahim was the Prophet ﷺ. He says in verse number 129, رَبَّنَا وَابْعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. O Allah, and raise amongst them, send amongst them a messenger who will recite to them from amongst them, from their people, one who would recite to them your verses, your signs. وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. And he will teach them your book, the book, وَالْحِكْمَةَ, and the wisdom. وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, and he will purify them. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. This is the dua. This is known as the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And he prayed that Allah will send to them. So everything that happened up to that point, including Sayyidina Ismail divorcing his wife, including leaving Hajar in this barren land, which was to become this great hustling, bustling city, all of this was from the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It had to happen that way, and it required the yaqeen of a prophet for that to happen. Sayyidina Ibrahim had to have complete certitude in order for that to happen. Now what's interesting is that just a couple of points to in case many of you probably won't be aware of this, but the Kaaba in its current form is not how it looked at the beginning. Yeah. So the Kaaba you're looking at isn't actually the structure that Sayyidina Ibrahim built, because the structure that he built was actually a lot wider. So there's just a little area. If those of you have been to Mecca and you visit the sanctuary, you'll see there's a little area which is known as Hijr Ismail. Yeah, it's called the Hijr Ismail. People go in and pray inside it, and you get the reward of praying in the Kaaba. And the reason for that is the original Kaaba included that, so that it was actually more rectangular. It included that section. It was a lot wider. Yeah, and what happened was that when the Kaaba was destroyed, because it was destroyed afterwards, there's been a number of occasions where the Kaaba was attacked and destroyed, and it was rebuilt. When it was destroyed, on that occasion, just before the time of the Prophet, they decided to rebuild it. Yeah, what I mean by before the Prophet announced his prophecy, they decided to rebuild it. And this is the whole. Many of you will be familiar with it when we get into the Sira of the life of the Prophet himself. We'll talk about this a bit more. But this is, for those of you who may be familiar with it, this is the occasion where Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the person that was passing by when these two warring tribes are trying to decide who it is that's going to place the Hajar Aswad in the Kaaba. Well, one of the things that they decided was they were going to only rebuild the Kaaba with money that was halal. Yeah, by their own standards, they decided we're not going to use any money that we've made through gambling, through any other racketeering that they were involved in. There was a lot of that stuff happening in the Jahiliyyah. They decided it would only be pure income. But the funny thing about the Jahili Arabs is that they couldn't, although they were very rich, they could not muster up enough halal income to build the haram as it was. So they all settled. They said, look, we've got to stick to our agreement that it's got to be halal. So they only built part of it, and they left that bit out. Yeah. So in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when he reconquered Mecca, he kept it as it was, which is why we've never changed it. We've always left it like that. Yeah. So actually, the dimensions of the Kaaba today are not the dimensions of the Kaaba that they were in the time of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So that's the first interesting thing to bear in mind. And actually, Hijr Ismail, just so you know, it's got nothing to do with Sayyidina Ismail. It's just a name that it was just given. Yeah, it's like a way of marking what the inside of the Kaaba originally would have been. So if you can't get to, they open the doors of the Kaaba once every year or maybe twice a year, and they only ever let dignitaries in. But if you ever get a chance to pray inside that area, then please, do make an effort to do so. And as I said, it was destroyed a few times, which means the blocks were constantly changed. And in the old days, it doesn't happen anymore now, but you can still find photos on the internet of this. In the old days, because there was no water filtration system, not filtration, kind of drainage system. It meant that whenever it rained heavily, it would get flooded, because you have to remember, Mecca is a valley. Yeah, it's a valley, which means if either side is mountainous, then the water gathers where it is, which means even as late as in the 1900s, you can see pictures of Mecca when it's flooded, completely flooded, where people are swimming. And historically, we have accounts of people swimming around the Kaaba. That's how they did the circumambulation. It's an amazing thing that we just won't be able to do now. But they would actually swim around the Kaaba. It was quite a normal thing whenever it rained to that extent. I mean, it rained very rarely, but when it did, it really did rain. And it all collected in there. So people would just swim around the Kaaba. So it would have been an amazing sight to see. So that was something that they would do. But that also meant that actually the stones that were built, that were holding the Kaaba together, would erode more frequently, which meant that actually in terms of rebuilding it and having to constantly change the stones, that was quite a frequent thing that they had to do. It's not so frequent now, just because it doesn't flood anymore, so it's a lot safer. And also the way it's built now in terms of the modern system, it's not really that much of a concern. I think they say every few hundred years that the Kaaba has to be rebuilt. And yeah, and so the last one was about, I think it wasn't that long ago, less than 50 years ago, I think, when they last rebuilt it. So the Kaaba it's not the physical structure that you're looking at. Isn't that structure? No, the structure that you're looking at isn't the structure that Sayyidina Ibrahim would have touched and put there. But the Kaaba represents, ultimately, it's the direction of obedience. It's the direction of that all Muslims face at any one time. So the power is actually in the history and in the symbolism of the Kaaba. So that's another thing, just in case you're not aware. And a third interesting point, which many of you won't be aware of, is we all see the Kaaba as being black, and that's what we're used to. But actually, historically, it wasn't black. Right? Historically, the Kaaba wasn't black. In fact, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it's said that he did place a kiswa over the Kaaba, and it was a Yemeni kiswa, and the chances are that it was I think it was green with bits of red in it, a bit like the thobe that the Prophet would wear. He had a thobe that had red stripes in it. Yeah, so we know there's an occasion that we had a green Kaaba with red stripes through it. We've also had the Kaaba was white for a number of years. It was white. In the time of the Seljuks, it was yellow. Just imagine a yellow Kaaba. It's also been red. In the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, Sayyidina Umar, it was, I think it was green, or was it white? I think it was white. So it's changed. It's taken dramatic change, because it was a kiswa that was just placed over it, and sometimes, and that over time became symbolic of the people that ultimately were the custodians. And the black actually stems from the Abbasids, because eventually the Abbasids, and their color was black with the La ilaha illallah, the Shahada written, and that stems from the Abbasid Caliphate. They eventually standardized it to a black, and it's never really changed. So it's always been black as far as we've known for many, many years. But there was periods where it was in a different color, and actually for a long period it was constantly changing color. So people didn't associate the color with the Kaaba, but we have come to do that. We found, in our time, over the last probably 30 years, we've seen some dramatic changes in the design of the kiswa, but actually the basic the sheet itself has always remained silk, and it's been black. So that's something that's something to just bear in mind, inshallah. Something to think about. In terms of the other thing that I want to touch on, inshallah, I'm not going to. I'll probably finish shortly. Just kind of in preparation for the next stage in this journey now, is when Sayyidina Ismail grew up amongst the Jurhum, and then he had children, and that continued on through the line of Sayyidina of Adnan. Next week I'm going to talk about each of the ancestors of the Prophet ﷺ, and then we will reach the point of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, inshallah. So I'm going to spend that time next week talking about them. Okay, so next week I want to talk about some of the lineage, just through each person and the significance and some of the characteristics, what we know about each of the ancestors of the Prophet. We'll make it to that. But for now, for today, what I want to just set the scene about is the Jahili Arabs and what they were like, and what we know about the basics of the landscape. Now, Sayyidina Ismail, as I said, his children, eventually we have this type of Arab known as the Adnani Arab, and they come through Sayyidina Ismail. But the Adnan to Sayyidina Ismail, there's a gap. We don't know how many children there were between Sayyidina Ismail and Sayyidina Adnan. Some say there were actually, Sayyidina Adnan was the son of Ismail. Yeah, I don't think that's a very strong opinion, but I'm definitely of the opinion that I follow Imam Malik's opinion here, in that he says it's makruh to try and be precise about things we just don't have any knowledge about. So I leave that blank between Sayyidina Ismail and Sayyidina. We've definitely have got, and I've got some myself. I've got books here that describe the people between Sayyidina Ismail and Adnan. But all of these are opinions of historians that have tried to piece it together with whatever little information they've had. but so it's not very reliable, and I think it's probably best to not cover that. So I'll go straight from say Adnan, and through his sons Ma'ad, etc., all the way back to the Quraysh, and then from Quraysh to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, and we do know bits about each of these people again through historical accounts, but it's a bit more reliable than what we know at that stage. So I think it's worth mentioning those. In terms of in Mecca itself, then there came a time where these Arabs that had come in from Yemen, that had some of the Jurhamis, etc. They were the people that made up what became known as the Jahili Arabs. The Jahili Arabs, combination of people that came to the lineage of Adnan. They were the people of Quraysh, and people that came from the Puritan, pure Arabs, from the people of Jurham, people of Saba. And they formed lots of different tribes. So you can slice and dice up these tribes based on their lineage in terms of which forefather they came from, which eventually goes to someone like Qahtan or goes to Adnan or whoever. Or you can divide them up as tribes, as in the groups, which is more about their geography. Or we can divide them up in terms of their worship. So if we look at in terms of first, let's start with their worship. So what we know about them is that the Jahili Arabs weren't just people who were idolaters. Amongst those Jahili Arabs, those historical Jahili Arabs, there were people that worshipped angels. There were Jahili Arabs that's what they call Jahili Arabs. They just, anything novel, they went for it. There were those that worshipped angels. There were those that worshipped jinn. There were those that were Christian, Arabs, early Christian Arabs. There were early Jewish, people there. There were Sabians there. There were, there were lots of different mixes of people over the centuries, leading up to the time of the Prophet that lived there. And there was a large group that were known as the idolaters, and they are the people that we hear most about when we get to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, and now these idol worshippers, the idols were divvied up based on the tribe that were based on based on the tribe. And next week I might talk a bit more about this, but for now, just so that you can get that just digest this, is to give you a few examples. Their largest idol, so the Jahili Arabs' largest idol that they all worshipped was called Hubal. And Hubal was placed on top of the Kaaba. Yeah, Hubal was on top of the Kaaba. They had another idol, which the Kalb had, which is another tribe of the Arabs, the Jahili Arabs. And they had an idol called Wud. Yeah. Another tribe called the Hudayl, they had an idol called Suwa'. And then you had the Manat, for example. The Manat was another idol, and that was left with the people of Aus and Khazraj, who feature heavily in the Sira. Inshallah, when we get to them, we'll talk about them in more detail. Then we had Isaf and Na'ila. Isaf and Na'ila were two idols that were placed on either end of Safa and Marwa. Yeah, Isaf and Na'ila, each of these idols were placed one on Safa and the other on Marwa. The Quraysh and the Banu Kinana, they looked after an idol called Uzza. So the Quraysh and Banu Kinana had the Uzza. And then you had the Lat. Lat was with the Banu Thaqif. And the Banu Thaqif lived where? In Ta'if. So the people who would eventually, towards the end of the Meccan period that attacked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this was the Banu Thaqif of Ta'if, and they were in charge of the Lat, and a few others. The Ya'uq, which was Hamdan. You had Nasr, who was the Zu Kila'a, who were some of the Himyari tribes, who were the children of Saba. There were lots of these different tribes, and each of them they were given charge of one of these idols, and that became their centerpiece. Yeah. So they almost had to work together because they all believed in these idols, but they had their central idol, their main idol, which is their identity as a tribe. So although they had to, so they kind of a connection. It was a bit like a mafia family, in that all of them had something that the other didn't have, and that all those keys kind of connected them, bound them together. But yet, the idol that you had and the location where you lived was was indicative of your status. Yeah, indicative of your status. So what I want to do next week is I want to talk about some of the forefathers of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then once we've got, as we go through them, I want to then also touch on how it is that the Jahili Arabs spread out in these tribes and moved to their different locations, and how did those idols come about, and where did these idols come from? And there's a story behind that too, which inshallah I will speak about next week. For now, the final thing I just want to say is, although the Jahili Arabs came up with a lot of preposterous things that were rejected by the Sharia, by Islam, and and that was that. There were lots of things that they did which were actually kept on. So the Islam didn't come to eradicate everything. It came to eradicate things that were harmful or not good for one's physical or spiritual self. So there were things that the Jahili Arabs had an understanding about, which we've held. For example, even though it was almost a commonplace, but it was commonplace, but it was something that was done. There were people, tribes that formed incestuous relationships, right? Where they married their sisters or brothers, or married their children, and so on. These things did happen, and you can read about in the books of history. Whereas the Jahili Arabs are very much against it, and that's something that that Islam has held on to. They were against, and the Jahili Arabs believed in the pilgrimage. They did their version of the Hajj, and we didn't remove the Hajj. We just removed the idolatry that was involved in it. Yeah. The other thing that used to happen, which the Jahili Arabs did not believe in, but actually did happen amongst other tribes and other communities, with this idea of marrying two sisters, where one could have more than one wife. That was commonplace. But they used to also sometimes marry two sisters, or even more than that, at the same time. And the Jahili Arabs, and Islam's against that. You're not allowed to do that at all. The second marriage is not even valid. But for the Jahili Arab, they were against it too. Again, it was incestuous. They didn't accept it at all. So they did have, I suppose the point here is that they had their own twisted morality. Yeah. And much of that led them to all sorts of nonsense. But some of it was actually something that was retained. They did do things like the Aqiqah. They did things like, which again, is something that we still do. So there were lots of practices, a number of practices that we kept, which the Sharia didn't eradicate because there was some good in them. But a lot of their practices, which mainly stem from idolatry, was completely rejected. And of course, their practice of infanticide, because that's the other thing that the Jahili Arabs did. They believed in there was a very strong patriarchal society, and it was governed and controlled by men, which meant you would do anything to have a male child. And daughters are seen as a drain on your family, a drain of resource, because you'd have to plow in 10 or 15 years worth of work for them to be economically useful for you. And then they get married, which means you can't even do it. Whereas with a boy, they can become economically active very quickly. And if not that, they can give you status. They can give you status, and they'll be expected to to support the parents and the families and so on. So it was a very powerful within their world. Yeah. Inshallah, we'll stop there. Jazakumullah khair. We'll continue the story next week, where we'll speak. No, we won't. We will. It's Ramadan, but we're going to sort out a timetable, inshallah, the next few days. But in the next lesson, we'll talk a bit about the forefathers of the Prophet. We'll spend a couple of minutes on each of these forefathers, and then we'll yeah, we'll take it from there, inshallah. So, jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.